Welcome to Healing Together. I'm Nicholas Boileau. Today I'm talking with MamaJay, who chose to be anonymous because we're talking about her son with borderline personality disorder. Our conversation addresses the stigma around this condition, which is the reason for her anonymity. In addition, we discuss how friends can make you feel as if you're doing something wrong, and the experience of parenting a child with this condition both before and after official diagnosis. We talk about dialectic behavioral therapy and critical lessons that helped MamaJay better handle her own life and show up as skillfully as possible as a mom. MamaJay also shares many of the resources that have helped her and her son on this difficult mental health journey. The conversation taught me a great deal about a topic that isn't talked about enough. I hope you get as much out of it as I did.
First of all, just want to thank you for picking this topic and for asking me to talk about it. And secondly, I think we had a conversation about whether or not we would do this anonymously or not. And I think that this version of making it anonymous has helped me give myself permission to be more vulnerable and perhaps maybe share things that I might not share or articulate if I hadn't allowed myself to go there. The other piece that I wanted to say around anonymously is just really around the stigma around mental illness is real. And the stigma around borderline personality disorder, which is something that my loved one has been told that he has symptoms of, has a strong stigma associated with it. The reasons for that are related to extreme behaviors that other people might not relate to or understand. It looks very different. And then the other piece is that there is a lot of stigma associated with borderline personality disorder depicted in the media. And so I think Fatal Attraction so there's some other media sources that for some reason are escaping my brain right now, but it's one that similar to schizophrenia, where it's just sort of displayed as, like a villain or like a monster. And that's what people think about when they hear it. And there's stigma associated with it that's affecting even the family members because people associate the disorder with those that have been abused or neglected in childhood, or that maybe it's the parents' fault. And so that can make it hard for other parents to talk about.
I personally have a bunch of friends now who have deep personal experience with children who have behavioral health issues. Some of them would be classified under borderline personality disorder. And a common thread for them is that it's really lonely because of the stigma. Can you talk a little bit about how the challenges have manifested in your life and some of the problematic behaviors?
Sure. And first, I just want to sort of validate what you said about your friend's experience in this space. It is very lonely. There is a lot of behavioral and mental health issues that people have that create further isolation and and that sort of leads right into, like explosive anger, for example. You share a story with someone and they react to that. And they might give you advice. Oftentimes it's misguided advice. Well, I wouldn't let my son talk to me that way, because sometimes explosive anger might just come across as being snippy or snarky, or if it doesn't reach the part where it's actually explosive. And so there's a combination of not only do people not get it or understand, make you feel like you're doing something wrong anyway, or sort of horrified by your own experience, but that also it can lead to poor, misinformed advice, because whenever you share something that you're going through, oftentimes people aren't just willing to sort of be there with you. They want to help you solve it. And if they don't have that sort of direct experience, they may give you the wrong advice and you sort of go in the wrong direction. And for me, it made me isolate more. It made me want to not really ask advice at that point.
Yeah. Do you end up feeling even some shame because you can't execute on the advice you're getting from well-meaning friends who just don't get it?
Yeah. And even well-meaning therapists. Like, for example, I was talking with a therapist about a situation that I was only using as an example, not trying to actually get advice on the specific thing that had happened, and it was related to washing dishes. And I was just talking about how my son was washing the dishes and he was just spraying it with hot water and not actually using soap and cleaning it, and how I had tried to explain to him that we need to use soap and I prefer if you use soap. And so all the ways that you would normally maybe have that conversation with somebody where you correct behavior is just very different. It manifests different in somebody who is afraid of criticism, or it can go very, very differently. And so she was like, well, did you ask him to try X? Did you ask him to try Y? What about if you ask him to vacuum instead? And I was like, oh my God, this is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this other element of it.
MamaJay, is this before you had a diagnosis for him?
It actually was after we had a potential diagnosis. He had a recent inpatient stay where we finally, he had several inpatient stays. Actually, this was his first inpatient stays, but he'd had a couple of trips to the emergency department and partial hospitalization programs and crisis center visits. But this was his first inpatient stay at a very acclaimed hospital. And this was the first time that they were like, maybe this isn't bipolar. Maybe this has borderline, and borderline symptoms. And so they didn't diagnose him there because they hadn't spent enough time with him. But when we went through the diagnosis, we were like, oh my gosh, this is it. And so there was a piece of us that was absolutely relieved. But what I didn't find was really strong ways to cope with it or what to do about it. And he had a therapist at the time that he was meeting with on a regular basis that wasn't focused on specifically borderline personality disorder. But and we can get into that later around like what kinds of therapies maybe should you be in. But this person was great and was also serving as a family therapist. And he was doing, a good job. But we had many places where his therapist was sort of suggesting to me that I might be stuck, that I might have too high of expectations. So this particular example came when I decided to start getting therapy for myself instead of just the family therapy. And we all know how hard it is to get a therapist that matches. All of her answers felt like I was talking to a girlfriend who didn't understand my situation. And all the frustrations and isolation were just sort of hitting in that same way.
Let's talk a little bit about the symptoms that you were noticing that were manifesting and some of the outcomes they were producing in your family life.
Sure. So we talked about the explosive sort of misdirected anger. And so, one example of that is it was around his birthday and he wanted an advance on his birthday gift because he had some car repair work that he needed to get done. And I was busy, distracted, whatever that might be. And I just didn't think that he had the right to sort of ask me for his birthday gift ahead of time. And this is before I had any skills or really understood. And so now at a future state, I kind of understand how I might have handled that differently. But basically, I pushed all of the buttons that you would not push in this situation if you were skillful. And his anger got very, very explosive. And it was sort of the first time that I've seen him be very explosive in anger about other things where I was sort of the person giving him comfort, but never sort of really directed at me. That can also look like self-harm, like he might kick something or hurt something, hurt like an object. But that causes him self-harm when he's like in that place. Self-harm and suicide ideation. So self-harm in the forms of like cutting is very, very hard for a mama bear. And then related to all of this impulsive behavior, they all kind of feed into each other. So like this reason why I was perhaps pushing on the gift thing was because he had this sort of impulsive behavior with money, this like sense of urgency and agitation when it comes to, just being in a lack of finances and how he spends them. And so I was always looking for an opportunity to like give a lesson, but I think it's less important to talk about the symptoms in many cases and really just sort of the outcomes or like what that means. And so I want to back way up for a second and just sort of maybe provide some context to who my son even is. And so he is this just really sharp, witty, fun amazing person. Like, I just can't even explain to you. People who meet him for the first time, especially adults, because I was a young mom when I had him. So he was around a lot of adults at a young age. He just converses really well with people who are older than him. He's empathetic and can connect very easy. He worked with me as an intern, actually, at my job. See, I have a very complex job, and he was sort of like able to understand my role. And even after he left that internship, like, have really interesting business conversations with me. I remember when he was little, he was probably like 8 years old, and we were in some like restaurant and we were eating, and we were the only people in the restaurant, and there was like 5 people working, and he was so sharp and observant and was just sort of like, I wonder how they make any money. Like, our food just costs $13 and there's a lot of people standing around. And just so like, just his brain is just beautiful and amazing. And again, I can't even express even the empathy and his coolness. Like, he's just an avid hiker. He's great at sports. He's adventurous. He left for an exotic land and lived on an island in a working the land, almost like how you would describe as homelessness. And just this amazing spirit. And even when he was little, he used to do things like learning to snowboard or things like that, where he was just fearless. He would just fall. And I would just, like, his tenacity, his confidence was just amazing. And so it's less about the symptoms that's sort of problematic for me, but it's seeing him lose his confidence because of these symptoms, and how over time, continuous pervasive symptoms like explosive anger, like feeling worthless and wanting to hurt yourself, and impulsive behavior, and having unstable relationships, it starts to weigh you down. Even the relationship instability piece is like, he has in some of his like relationships, either if it's with work or friends or romantic, they haven't been going well. Let's just say he has a not a great track record lately with relationships. And I remember when he was a teenager and he had a girl that was sort of playing with his heart, and he was like, I used to think there was something wrong with me, but I just realized, like, I'm an amazing boyfriend and I'm going to make somebody really happy someday. And it was like that kind of confidence, where now, after sort of repeated behavior and repeated pieces, like, I'm not sure he would say that to you today, or he feels that way today.
It sounds like a landscape of just incredible contrasts, right? You have this incredible intelligence and wit and articulateness and ability to connect with people. And then in contrast to that, these moments of extreme difficulty. And it sounds like what you're saying is one of the results is to his own self-worth and self-confidence as he sees himself behave in ways that really don't mesh with generally accepted behavior.
Correct.
That must be incredibly hard to see as a parent. And it sounds like he had more confidence. And then did this come on as a young man or a teenager?
Yeah, when he came back from that sort of amazing island experience that we talked about. He'd had a few moments there where he was losing a bit of his self-confidence and like was a little bit emotionally extra or emotionally dysregulated. And it was very hard on me because we were so close, and to see your son in pain so far away was really challenging. And maybe, so I don't really know. I don't want to go into like cause and effect, but it was also during a time where, just even the coming of age, when you're graduating from high school and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with your life, and having these, like, in some ways, that island experience that I just described was traumatic, right? Like that was a big change in lifestyle. And it was definitely something that rocked his world. Long story short is that, some of the parents that I talk to that have loved ones with borderline personality disorder symptoms have like sort of always had them. They've kind of been the difficult child, and those sort of transpired into adulthood and just got bigger and maybe scarier as they got older. And in some cases, like with my son, it has been that it's been sort of the polar opposite, just as you described. It was like somebody who felt very capable and confident and proud and just able to do so many things. and then had this sort of shift. And I think in hindsight, some of those shifts were happening sooner than I sort of recognized or realized.
As you've grown to learn about this and understand a bit more, how have you learned to frame the interactions and the behaviors in your own mind? And how does that inform how you're able to interact with your son?
Well, so it's interesting because when the explosive anger happened and it was sort of directed at me, that was right around the time when I first got introduced to somebody to a support group that was going to provide me with education and skills around this sort of some sort of piece. And as part of the intro, they did a video where they were interviewing families and actually loved ones that had borderline personality symptoms, with the goal of sort of sharing the trajectory and that there's hope and remission and recovery is possible. And it was this like beautiful video about how life can change. But there was this one woman in the video that just stuck out to me. I can still picture her today, who was describing her daughter's explosive anger and was talking about how, and I forget who the comedian is that she referenced, but there's a comedian who had a very hands-on approach to their skit and would like throw watermelons in as part of it. And so if you were coming to one of his performances, you would sit in the front row, you would wear a poncho, and you would let this watermelon juice just sort of rush over you or go over you, and you would just sort of prepare for it, and that you wouldn't be sort of affected by the watermelon juice. And I remember the fury that I felt listening to that woman speak, because that's not the life I wanted. I didn't want to let things wash over me like watermelon juice. And I didn't think it was right the way that I was being talked to. I didn't think it was okay. I was really upset. And sometimes when we leave the present moment and start thinking about all the what ifs and like, well, what if I just let it roll off of me? Like, what's going to happen when he's in a job? What's going to happen when he's in a relationship? Are they just going to let watermelon juice just flow over them? And sort of, I got sort of caught up in like, I don't think that that's right. Watermelon juice or whatever it is, just, I don't know, the analogy didn't fit with me and didn't feel possible or appropriate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You can't really ask your boss to just deal with it like watermelon juice.
Exactly. And so then I went to sort of more support groups and I got more information. And I think what happened for me in terms of the framing that changed the way that I look at this is that it's really about education. And that's the other piece associated with stigma, is when we keep our stories secret, when we don't talk to others, we miss the opportunity to understand and to create information. And I just want to, get on my high horse for a second. And you have to be very careful about where you get that information. For example, if you type in borderline personality disorder and you go on a support group page like Quora, they're going to tell you these horrifying things, but it's not anything that is like usable or productive. It just puts you into sort of a more distressed state around. It's not understanding. Well, it sort of is understanding because you're getting a firsthand view, but people just say terrible things and progress the stigma. And so you just have to sort of be really careful about where you get your information and understanding. But I have to say, like, that's the key to everything, isn't it? Just the more you understand about another culture, it creates a bridge, right? The more you understand about what another person's perspective, it creates a bridge. And so for me, the real piece that sort of started to frame this was a key understanding of what sort of the emotional transaction that was happening for him. Like just understanding like the fact that there's like a pathway that is understood for how emotional dysregulation happens is like what really changed things for me. So even just that information was amazing. And then the other piece was really about, now that you know this, what do you do about it?
And what do you do about it?
Well, I mean, so that's the other piece too, is so when I was in these support groups, I have a friend who also has an adult daughter that's actually not in her life anymore. And that her experiences didn't go well. And so she's been sort of someone who I've talked to a lot because she gets it firsthand. Nothing that I say sounds too crazy, and is absolutely intrigued and interested to hear about what I'm learning because she's replaying or revisiting her own experiences and maybe even trying to figure out like, well, where did I go wrong? Or what could I have done differently, as part of her own journey into what was that. That
must, I'm just going to stop you there because that must be a huge part of this is self-doubt and potential regrets, and just, wondering if you've done a good job as a parent.
Exactly. And so that's the key piece, is that once you understand the pathways and understand the transactions, and then you start to develop skills, you start to feel empowered. And what that does for the psyche is that even if this isn't going the way that I want it to go, I know I responded in the way that was sort of right and left me feeling good inside. Because the other piece is you start to lose your sense of self. You stop feeling whole in all of this. It becomes very big and suffocating around what's happening. And, you start to feel out of control. You don't know what to do. And as you start to get skillful and you start to see successes in what you're doing and how things are changing, you start to feel really good and empowered. But my point about this friend is that so I'm teaching her the transactional model, and we can get into some of the aspects of it and just giving her some background information about the condition and, all of these things. And then she's like, so what do you do about it? What do you do? And I was like, I don't know yet. We're not that far in the lessons. And she was like, you must be dying. And I'm like, I am, because I'm a doer. I'm not used to being somebody who just listens and learns. And so that was a key piece to my journey, was really just listening and sitting with information for a while. And it happened to coincide with a little bit of a falling out. So my son and I had some space while I was learning, which I really feel for some of the other parents who have been in my support circles, who their loved one is very close to them in proximity, and they're learning the skills and learning the understanding while they're dealing with it on a day-to-day. So I'm sort of blessed in so many ways about the falling out, so that we were able to have the space where I could really take some time for reflection. But anyways, this friend was like, when do you get to do? And she's like, it must feel like you're in a bottom of a pool and it just keeps filling up with water and filling up with water. And they're telling you can't swim yet. You just can't swim.
Let's pause on that a second, because I'm so interested in that. There is something that you are doing in contrast to the watermelon juice analogy.
Sure. And so she wasn't necessarily recommending that I took the watermelon juice approach. She was just sort of sharing her before and after, and sort of being like, this is how life used to be. And now it just flows over me. And that was like never something I wanted for myself. I think that's like one pathway, but it's not one for me. And that's the other piece, is one of the skills you start to learn is about what are your own limits. One of my own limits is I just can't tolerate explosive anger. And it's okay to have anger. I just want to sort of say that, like, you never want to repress somebody's own emotions, but what you do want to do is to help them accurately express themselves. But I think part of it is, one, being comfortable with emotions. So that's part of my contribution to this, is that I think even in his whole life, while I was raising him, that I don't think I let him feel the feelings. I think that when things got a little bit heated or got a little bit extra, that I always toned it back to a normal state. It's not that you can't have explosive anger. Explosive anger is absolutely warranted at times. But what I have been trying to focus on is what is actually going on for him in those angry moments. So it's like versus what's being directed at me versus what's going on for him. And we just don't have those moments anymore.
And it sounds like what you're saying is it's okay to feel explosive anger, but then it's a question of how does that translate into your behavior?
Exactly.
And early on, you might have been unintentionally saying you shouldn't be feeling these feelings.
Exactly. Or not giving the space for it. One example for that would be a time when my son was he lost his job. And so this is not something that was uncommon or that we weren't used to. He had a sort of a history of losing jobs, either being fired or walking out on the job because something would always happen. And his explosive anger often became, part of the challenge. And so in all those other previous examples of jobs being left, I might directly skip the part about losing your job. When you lose your job, it is very scary and terrifying about how are you going to earn money. And if you keep doing this, you start to wonder about what's your longevity in a career. Like, am I even career material? Can I hold down a job? There's a lot of shame. And like, this is the third time this has happened to me. Is there something wrong? Are all these jobs just really terrible jobs? Or is there something wrong with me? What do I do now? Somebody who really is financial stability is a real stabilizing factor for. So now their finances are no longer in check. The old me used to jump right to solutioning. And we would just sort of skip. So what are you going to do now? Are you going to apply for new jobs? Are you going to try to get unemployment? Should we talk about disability? How are you going to pay your bills? I would ask all the questions without giving him even the breathing space or moment to hold the truth that like, it is unsettling to lose your job. This must feel lots of different ways, and just even giving moments for him to breathe and feel before jumping into solutions. The other piece is that when somebody is emotionally aroused, they actually cannot access the part of their brain where logic and reason work. And so by jumping and skipping all the emotional parts, not only was that repressive, but it also isn't feasible. It's not helpful. And I didn't know that about my own style. And so in a more recent case, now that I've had this training in education and reframing, I gave him moments of like, wow, like I've actually never lost my job. I'm very lucky and fortunate in that way. But I can only imagine what that would feel like to lose my job. And I know this isn't the first time you've lost your job. Like, are you okay? You want to talk about that? It was amazing because I think that he had expected in that moment of calling mom and having to, can you imagine the shame of having to make that phone call yet again? And so he was already on the defensive. He was ready for a fight, essentially. He was ready to be like, my mom doesn't understand or get me. I can't believe I have to tell her this. And for me to almost like disarm the conversation in a way, that wasn't my intention to disarm it. My intention was to give him the right thing. And I gave him the right thing in the moment based on what he needed. And what he needed was love and compassion for his situation. That completely diffused the bomb, right, of how that conversation could have otherwise gone. And he, by the end of the call, was feeling hopeful and he was naming solutions. He's like, well, I think I might look at unemployment. There's an X, Y, and Z jobs near me that I'm thinking about applying for. And he was in a place that was from highly agitated at the top of the call to a place where there was no watermelon juice that needed to be avoided in that call because it didn't get there.
Yeah, that sounds like compassion first and second, see what happens. And that must be so counterintuitive in the moment when my first instinct would be saying, now calm down, let's talk about how we can solve this.
Exactly.
And calm down is probably a way to ignite defensiveness and anger, the likes of which I'm not ready for.
And the other piece is, of course, you're agitated. Of course, you're nervous. Like those Me Too moments as well, or those opportunities to say like validating what's real for you is just sort of that's into the sort of skill development side.
So in this area of skill development, can you talk briefly about some of the other skills you've developed along the way?
So the skills that have been really, really helpful to me are really around, they're called relationship mindfulness. And it's so a lot of us, maybe many of us are in sort of that self-help mode and we're like learning about how to be present, how to meditate, how to like close your eyes and what do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see? Pay attention to your breath. That's all about your own mindfulness. Relationship mindfulness is doing that for somebody else, is being present with them, for them, subtracting the future, subtracting the past, and just being in the moment for somebody. It's incredibly, incredibly hard to do. And so the work, so that's under the umbrella of relationship mindfulness. And then there's sort of sub skills that you develop underneath that umbrella. But the first piece is that you have to make up your mind about the relationship. And so for me, this is a primary relationship. He's my best friend. He is my, I just love this kid more than anybody. Like, I'm tearing up thinking of how much I love him. And for me, the relationship is the most important thing.
When you say relationship mindfulness, you're pausing and you're allowing yourself to feel how important your relationship with him is in that moment, right? So you're filling your mind with, what is my priority here?
Exactly. And so my first thing that I had to do while I was alone, not experiencing anything in the moment, was I had to ask myself, what do I want from this relationship? And then obviously, so I'd actually put relationship second, because the first one, and it is most important and probably obvious, is I also want him to live. I don't know what the statistics are, but it's very high. Although we talked about the hope for this condition, it's also the one with the highest suicide rate. And the reason for that is because a lot of the behaviors, the shame, etc., lead to self-harm and suicide ideation, but they also have impulsivity. They tend to have impulsivity as a symptom. And so when you combine impulsivity and suicide ideation and self-harm, that's a dangerous combination. It's very real for many of us about the mortality of our kids.
So that must be just a constant fear that weighs on you.
Yes. So that's the first thing. So the other piece is that I just don't want to make this worse for him, right? Like I just want to do the right things so that he can see his life as valuable as I do and as important as I do.
You're approaching the situation. It's like you're able to switch gears and go into a receptive mode where your main priority is your relationship and taking care of him, being helpful to him versus harmful.
Exactly. And that happens in every situation. But before I was even ready to tackle situations, I had to meditate on that. I had to ask myself if that's true. And so I know that that's like a hard concept, because you're like, of course it's true. It's not necessarily like when you're at a point where you're like, this isn't like, oh my God, like this, you come to a point where you sort of accept the fact that your kid may die. And it is important that they don't. I had to meditate even before I was ready to get into situations. And by meditation, for anybody who thinks that those words are scary about meditation, all meditation means to me is to really focus on like love, or focus on an object. And so for me, it was like, just what do I want for my son? And it's, what does he want for himself? But it's
what you said about, I have to come to terms, or I may have to come to terms with the fact that my child may die, is something incredibly hard that I've heard from other parents. And they come to this point, it seems like, where they realize a major part of what's going on is just out of their control. Without ever becoming comfortable with it, they become more aware, maybe, of the fact that they may lose their child. And it seems like a horrendous barrier to go through, but a very real one.
Exactly. And so that's the work, right? So like there's a piece of it of like sort of coming to terms with that, but then also saying that how do you settle that for yourself? Is that you say, I want to be as skillful and as present for my child as possible, so that I know that I did everything I could in the event that happens. So there's that piece that I had to come to terms with. And then the second piece is the relationship mindfulness, is because the other piece about like, it's kind of funny. You almost can dismiss that part of it, at least in my process, because as soon as I sort of made peace with it and I felt good about the way that I show up for my son now, I don't worry about that as much. And it might actually be maybe because that doesn't feel like a high likelihood anymore, which is amazing. Like that's an amazing story of how that's changed. But part of that is because I've come to terms with it and I recognize that I only want to be part of the reasons why he feels grounded in this world.
So he's learning some skills even as you're exercising the skills that you've learned.
Absolutely. And they go hand in hand. So sort of going back to relationship mindfulness. So when a situation arises, yes, I first remember that I just want to be present for him. I'm going to forget about what's going on for me in this moment. And I don't mean forget about it. It's not like I push it away. I actually tune in just like you would with your own meditation. Where am I? I do a self-scan and a check. And like, am I ready to be present for someone else? Am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I busy? Am I agitated? Am I multitasking? Not able to be present for somebody else. So first step I do is that scan. And when I'm ready to be present for him, if I'm not in the moment, I tell him, hey, so I want to be very present for you. I can hear that what's going on for you is really, a big deal. I'm actually in the middle of a work call. I've got this going on. Is it okay if we check in and I give whatever the circumstance appropriate amount of time? Like maybe when I get out of work, I'll have that energy for you. I'll have that presence for you. Or if it seems like it's an emergency, then I might say, I'm going to cancel my meeting and I'm going to go take some deep breaths. I'm going to drink some water so I can be present for you. So another piece with folks with borderline personality traits is they tend to need you a lot, and everything seems like an urgent emergency. And so I check in with myself and with him, like, am I able to be here for you in your emergency? In that moment. So the first part is my own scan. Can I be present for someone else? The second thing that I do is say, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? And it's, again, that the relationship is very important to me. So I ground myself in the fact that I love this person beyond anything, and that I just see them in their humanity, and and I'm compassionate and connecting into his humanity, his existence, before I even engage. The other skills that we learn are about non-judgment, which basically means sometimes it's even just subtle in the way he could be in a conversation or just overhearing a conversation where you're talking about someone else, or you're being harsh and judging your own self. And those judgments lead to shame. And so learning about what judgment is and how to stop yourself from doing it. One of the exercises that Marsha Linehan, who's one of the founders of dialectical behavioral therapy or is the founder of dialectical behavioral therapy, talks about, hey, what if you were just to count your judgments in one evening? Just how many times are you placing judgment? And you'd be surprised, even just in your mind, how many times you're doing them. And so I eliminate judgment in those moments when those situations occur, meaning I know nothing, I assume nothing, and I don't try to connect them to good or bad. So that's sort of the next thing that I do. And then the key thing that I do is validate. For folks that have borderline personality traits, they inaccurately express themselves. And so what happens is that if they're displaying anger, for example, but really they're sad or overwhelmed, you, the person, reacts to the anger and not to the actual thing that's happening. You might not even know what the actual thing is that's happening. So what validation allows us to do, or what I do with validation, is I find out what's real. So if I'm present and I'm in tune with you, that goes back to my story about the job loss. Like, I'm so present with you, I can imagine losing my job. I can imagine losing my job over and over again. And I can imagine what feelings are there. And what I'm doing is validating that that's a really hard and challenging moment in your life. And what happens is they feel seen. So they're more likely to feel better, that like, okay, I'm not crazy here, right? Like, of course I feel bad. This is a bad situation. Other people would feel bad given the circumstances. It's okay to feel bad. When you validate somebody, just like you said, when you tell somebody, now calm down, right? That's invalidating them, that only escalates the conversation. And so that's kind of what I was saying about the explosive anger. We don't reach explosive anger anymore because I was skillful. Now, that's not the same as watermelon juice lady. That wasn't just letting emotions flow over me like watermelon juice. That was me being very present, and wanting to do the right thing and being in tune in the conversation about what to ask next.
It sounds like you've learned a whole lot of new skills. Has he at the same time been working on his end to learn new skills?
Well, it's a good question. So for him, he's had similar training to what I just described. And part of it is learning for him through dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a very common one. If you know anybody with borderline personality symptoms, like go get some DBT, like just go do that for you and for your loved one, just go do that. And so he already was very empathetic. And that's part of the challenge of maybe somebody with borderline personality disorder is probably actually very empathetic. And they may seem like they're self-centered or because their behaviors don't match, but that's part of their gift is they're very empathetic because they're very sensitive. And what dialectical behavioral therapy is helping them reality check the things that they're sensing, which oftentimes they're right. They are actually accurate, but actually accurately naming the emotion they're feeling related to it and validating what's actually valid about their situation. So because they have that shame cycle that we were talking about earlier, it can create strange behavior. Shame can do funny things to people. And so when you have strange behaviors, people respond to your strange behaviors, whether that's through staying away from you, withdrawing from you, or by combating with you. And that those can all lead to further shame cycles. And so what dialectical behavioral therapy teaches is this sort of mindfulness around what's actually going on and helping you with the skills to be able to validate for yourself what's real in what you're feeling and what's the valid actions. What are like the situational appropriate responses? And so we're both learning those things at the same time, which is amazing.
I know this is a really stigmatizing condition and a stigmatizing issue to have in your family. Have there been peers you could talk to or any sort of peer-to-peer model, including Health Together, where you're a health angel? And can you talk about how that has helped you or how they could help in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's just connecting with people who get it. We already talked about the stigma and how isolating it is. To be able to actually connect with somebody who gets it is amazing. And that's sort of obvious and expected, right? The other thing that was strange for me the first time I connected with a peer support group was I remember the moment on the Zoom call when all the faces popped up of these other families that had borderline personality disorder traits in their family and that they were dealing with various problematic conditions. And I remember seeing all their faces and I had to shut my camera off and sob because I was so sad that other people were experiencing that too. Like it was, so it's interesting that I don't want to be isolated. I want to be connected, but I was so sad to realize that there were so many people going through this. It was like that bad that I was like, I don't wish this for anyone. And here's some real people. And so what I think becoming a health angel so in the particular peer support group that I'm talking about, I was so touched and moved by the rest of the programming that I actually became a facilitator of their support groups. But when we talk about Health Together, it's because I'm interested in being a health angel because there's all these people who are experiencing exactly what I've experienced, or not exactly nuanced, but similar, where we can help each other. And I just think that we can offer each other hope and camaraderie and skill development and cheer each other on and resources. And it's just, I just don't think I would be where I am today without the peer support that I received through NEABPD, which is the peer support group that I am now a support group leader for, or even just having conversations with you, Nicholas, and, you know, being sort of that formative group for Health Together and just thinking about how I might help others. Even just thinking about helping others has been helping me.
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental truth of life is that often when you're in pain, helping someone else actually lightens your load.
I just also want to point out one downside of it, but it's also a good side of it, is that you have to face it more often. And so sometimes when I engage, like it takes a lot for me to engage in a support group or even on conversations on Health Together, et cetera, because I have to, in some ways, relive my own experience. And it's a lot easier to not relive it. And so going there and being vulnerable for other people, there's a balance that I'm learning to strike for myself. Just wanted to sort of call out that it's positive and negative, but I think that you can actually say that negative is actually a positive, because we should be accessing that. Like, we don't necessarily want to suppress our emotions or what we're going through. It's not, sometimes it gives me the pause to like reflect and check in with myself that I wouldn't normally do had I not been trying to support or teach others.
Right. Absolutely. And we all have our limits, and we all need to be cognizant of the fact that you can get depleted, and each of us has different ways of recharging our batteries.
Exactly.
You've been talking quite a bit about BPD, borderline personality disorder. I think you mentioned once or twice emotional dysregulation. Is there a change in the terminology that's going on around this illness?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of folks that are looking to sort of change the way that we talk about this, because borderline personality disorder is an outdated term. I won't get into sort of where its origins are. I think you can look it up and see. But it doesn't explain anything. What do you mean by borderline? Borderline of what? And I think more accurately calling it emotional dysregulation, because we can all relate to being emotionally dysregulated, and they're just emotionally dysregulated, maybe a little extra. So maybe they're emotionally extra. And so I think that one of the major things that we could do is reframe the terminology that we use around it so that we can normalize not the behaviors. I'm not looking to normalize the behaviors. The behaviors, in many ways are they're maladaptive, frankly. What I'm talking about is changing the terminology so that people can relate to their own emotional dysregulation and create opportunities for themselves to, first of all, connect with their own emotions and understand their emotions and their roles. But also, by normalizing it, I think we can put it on a spectrum of emotional dysregulation where all the same skills that I've been talking about work. And so whether you're somebody, so one of the things about borderline personality disorder or emotional dysregulation is that you're more sensitive than most. So that basically means you bump into more things. You're more reactive than most. So when you do bump into something, you might react more significantly than someone else, or more dramatically than someone else, which could look like withdrawal or could look like explosive anger. And the third piece is that you're slower to return to baseline. So imagine you bump into something that gets you aggravated and you overreact, and now you feel shame about the way that you reacted. You're actually more likely to bump into more things because you're at a higher state of agitation. So just like when you're hungry or tired or other biological factors, you're more likely to bump into these things. And so that's true for every single person. The only difference between those with borderline personality disorder or emotional dysregulation disorder is that that's pervasive, and they tend to stay at a state of not returning to baseline, at a state of agitation. So they're bumping into more things, and then by nature are more reactive, by temperament, by the way they were designed, are more reactive.
I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask, if I'm a parent and I want to learn more of these skills, or an employer or a person who suffers from emotional dysregulation, borderline personality disorder, where would you recommend I look?
First of all, if you connect with anything that I talked about, there's so much underneath and so many layers and complexities. There was so much I wanted to say that I didn't even say. The conversation actually went in a different direction, which is okay. Maybe we can do this again another time. But I just want to call out that I am MamaJay on Health Together, and I'm absolutely happy to just connect with people, hear what's going on for them, and share whatever it is that they want to talk. Any resources I have, or, whatever, just reach me on Health Together. But I'm just going to fire through a list. I actually wrote them down before we get on the call. Things that have been life-changing for me. So first of all, NEA BPD, which is Family Connections Program, which is the support group that I was talking about. Google it, NEA BPD, Family Connections. Like, oh my God, do that immediately. The other piece, and it fits in sort of this Tibetan Buddhism aspect of it, is Pema Chodron has a book called When Things Fall Apart, Heartfelt Advice for difficult times, that was just an amazing book. For the employer side, but also for anybody, there's this amazing book that Chris Voss put out there that's called Never Split the Difference: How to Negotiate Like Your Life Depends on It. And he's a former hostage negotiator, and his skills that he used to navigate hostage situations for the FBI, terrorism attacks, those kinds of things, were all about using empathy and relationship mindfulness. And I think it'll blow your mind, and how to apply that into your career.
I love that book. I read it and just love it.
The other one is, I didn't actually read these books, but I've heard other people talk great about them, which is Walking on Eggshells. I bought Grieving Mental Illness, and I just want to point out, just as an aside, that this sucks. It sucks. And it's not necessarily the life you wanted for yourself or for your others. And I think about, even just on social media, when, my son is in his 20s now, and other people are like celebrating their milestones, including graduations and new jobs and moving and new relationships, and relationships that are turning into marriages, and marriages that are turning into babies, and just all the happy stuff that you see on social media, that there's an aspect of like, that's not my life. That's not my son's life. And I don't know what resources there are out there for grieving mental illness, but it's been a huge part of my personal work with my therapist. And I didn't read the book because it didn't connect with me, but other people have said great things. Is the grieving mental illness. It's real. Doesn't matter what mental illness you're talking about, or even physical illness. I'm sure there's just a grief that we have to go through. And then the other one is Rachel Bloom. I don't know if anybody knows who she is, but she did My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend television series. And she's openly borderline personality disorder traits. And she has a book called I Want to Be Where the Normal People Are. And it's a hilarious storytelling about her journey with borderline personality disorder that makes you relate. And it's just an inside view. The other one is a TED Talk called Love No Matter What by Andrew Solomon. And it just talks about when your family's different than other families, how what's universal is that every family is different. Whether your family has mental illness or your family has other differences, maybe you have somebody who's experienced like transgender, or maybe you have somebody who has a physical ailment, or, whatever, that every family, if you look at it, is different, and that unites us. And it teaches this amazing, beautiful story about how we as families love no matter what. And it's just incredible. And then anything by Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, Glennon Doyle, like those are all the people those are my, podcast and books on tape that I listen to.
They're great mindfulness teachers.
Yeah, approachable ones. I think that's what I love about it.
Yeah.
I'm also into some Buddhist, deeper Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist things that may not be sort of accessible to everybody yet. And if you want me to tell you those resources, I will if you reach me out on Health Together.
That's great. Thank you so much, MamaJay. With all the people I've met who've had family members suffering, I think one of the worst parts is this feeling of isolation. And as you said, grief, I don't get that other life that I see on Facebook, and the despair that comes from feeling so alone. I think this kind of conversation has to become more commonplace. I really appreciate you taking the risk of talking about it and being vulnerable. And I have a feeling this is going to help a lot of other people. So thank you, MamaJay, and good luck to you. And let's do it again.
Thank you, Nicholas, for this opportunity. Be well.
Healing Together is produced by Health Together. Our theme song is Ramble, composed and performed by Ed Morneau.